She treated him like a homeless drifter, not knowing he was the millionaire owner of the hotel. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Andrea Bennett adjusted the scarf around her neck and for the third time that morning tried to ignore the lukewarm taste of her coffee, long cold in its paper cup. The lobby of the St. Clair Hotel was still quiet, just like it usually was. In the early hours, a few guests were having breakfast in silence in the main hall, surrounded by pale marble columns and tastefully arranged floral displays. Andrea was going through the day's check-in list on the computer when the revolving door spun slowly, and seconds later, a man stepped in. She looked up and nearly spilled her coffee. The man looked like he'd just walked out of a trail in the Rockies. His beard was unshaven, hair messy, a massive backpack sagged against his shoulders. His sweatshirt looked like it had been through several decades, and his sneakers were crusted with dried mud. Andrea stood up at once, stepping out from behind. The front desk, with a polite but practiced smile, positioning herself between him and the breakfast area, where their more demanding guests enjoyed their croissants with views of the courtyard garden. "Sir, are you lost?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. There was something strange about the man. His face was striking, his eyes far too alert for someone supposedly living on the streets, but his overall appearance made people uneasy. "If you'd like, I can direct you to a shelter. There's one just a few blocks from here." The man gave a slight smile and adjusted the strap on his backpack. "Actually, I'd like a room." Andrea blinked twice, thinking she'd misheard him. "A room here at the St. Clair?" she muttered. Her eyes darted toward the guests, especially Mrs. Whitmore, a woman from the Upper East Side who was already wrinkling her nose, clearly ready to file a complaint. "Rooms here start at $400 a night, sir. And that's just the base rate. Prices go much higher depending on the category." The man nodded calmly. "I understand." Andrea hesitated, then reached into her purse and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. "At least take this. Get yourself a sandwich, maybe some coffee. You look like you need it." The gesture, unexpected and oddly sincere, made the man pause. He looked at the money with a mix of tenderness and confusion. Joshua Carter held the bill in his hand for a second, as if unsure what to do with it. Something about that moment stirred something deep within him. He wasn't used to strangers showing concern, not real concern, not for him. "I really appreciate it," he said softly, "but I'd still like a room. I have a card." Andrea sighed, irritated. "Backpackers always promise they can pay," she murmured, turning on her heel. "All right, let's give it a try, but if there's any issue, you'll be asked to leave immediately." She made a small motion with her hand, the universal "one mistake and you're out." As they walked back toward the desk, she subtly signaled to Marcus, the morning shift security guard. The man was far too polite to be just another drifter, but she had seen stranger things. "Full name, please?" she asked, fingers poised over the keyboard. "Joshua Carter," he replied. "ID and card, please." He handed both over without hesitation. The ID was a little dusty but valid. "What kind of room are you looking for, Mr. Carter?" She wasn't expecting a clear answer and had already opened the tab for the lowest rates. "Whatever's available," he said. "We have a standard room, comfortable, well-equipped, $250 a night." Joshua tilted his head slightly. "And the presidential suite? Is that available?" Andrea stopped typing. "Excuse me," she asked, narrowing her eyes. "The presidential suite. If it's vacant, I'd like to stay there." She checked the system. It was, in fact, available, but it cost nearly $3,000 per night. "It is available, yes, but as you might imagine, the price is quite steep." "That won't be a problem," he said. The disbelief on her face was obvious. "All right then, I'll run the card, just as a precaution." She swiped it. It was matte black with no logo, and held her breath, waiting for it to decline. But the screen flashed. Payment approved. Her brow furrowed as she looked from the terminal back to him. All set? He asked. Yes, it is, she replied, still not sure what had just happened. Andrea glanced at the card one more time. Something didn't add up. For safety, she called the bank. She spoke softly, reading off the numbers while keeping an eye on him. When the representative confirmed it belonged to a VIP client with no credit limit, Andrea thanked her and hung up quietly. She asked him to sign 3 forms, checking each signature against his ID with the focus of a forensic analyst. One more thing, she said, picking up her phone. I need a photo for our internal record. It's protocol for special guests. Joshua patiently obliged. She snapped 3 photos, all with flash. Done. The presidential suite is on the top floor. The private elevator is next to the main staircase. Just then, a voice came from behind. Everything all right here, Andrea? It was Daniel Walker, the hotel manager. All good, Mr. Walker. I'm just finishing check-in for Mr. She glanced at the card again. Carter. As soon as Daniel heard the name, his expression shifted entirely. His eyes widened with recognition and his smile broadened, now unmistakably genuine. Mr. Carter, what an honor to have you back, he said, reaching out eagerly. Andrea watched the scene, completely baffled. The manager shook the man's hand with something close to reverence. Was the trip productive? Daniel asked. Enlightening, Joshua replied lightly. A bit different from the usual routine. The manager chuckled politely. If you need anything at all, we're at your service. Andrea stepped closer to Daniel quietly. Can we talk for a moment? He followed her to the side of the desk. I think he might be a con artist, she whispered. The look doesn't match, but the card worked. Daniel glanced back at Joshua, who was calmly examining the nearby flower arrangement. Andrea, do you know who he is? Some fallen heir? A lottery winner, she offered. Daniel sighed. Something like that. A few feet away, Joshua caught parts of the exchange. Lottery winner, he muttered to himself with a crooked smile. Easier than explaining the billions. Andrea left work that evening with her shoulders tense and her pace faster than usual. She was still trying to make sense of what had happened that morning. A man who looked like a wandering backpacker, with worn-out sneakers and the overall appearance of someone who hadn't showered in days, had just checked into the most expensive suite in the hotel. And more than that, the manager had greeted him with a kind of reverence she had never seen before. It was hard to process. Instinctively, she pulled her coat tighter around her body as she stepped out the side employee exit, where staff usually left their uniforms in individual lockers. It was cold, but that wasn't what made her uncomfortable. It was the sense that she had missed something important. Her mind spun with the contrast between appearances. Someone so off the grid shouldn't have access to that level of luxury, and yet there he was, on the top floor, probably taking a bath in a tub worth more than everything she owned in her tiny Brooklyn apartment. The next morning, just before 7, Andrea arrived at the front desk and froze halfway to her station. Joshua was already back in the lobby. His hair was still uncombed but dry, his beard untouched, and he was wearing a clean shirt, probably new, along with the same oversized backpack. She furrowed her brow. The image was almost comical. A guest staying in the presidential suite, wandering around with a backpack that looked like it had survived military deployment. She approached him cautiously, suspicious, as if expecting him to do something unusual. "Sleep well?" she asked, unable to hide the trace of irony in her tone. "Very well, thank you," he replied, perfectly polite. "Breakfast is served. Until 10, she informed him, just like she did with every guest. "But I can have room service sent up if you prefer." He smiled faintly. "I'd rather eat outside. Any bakery around here you'd recommend?" The question caught Andrea off guard. No guest from the presidential suite had ever asked for a neighborhood bakery. Still, she gave him the name of one around the corner. He nodded in appreciation and walked out, no rush in his step. A few minutes later, while Andrea was still mentally replaying the exchange, Daniel showed up at the desk with a slightly amused expression. "Guess who asked about you?" he said, leaning against the counter. Andrea looked at him warily. "About me?" Daniel nodded. "Joshua Carter. He wanted to know your work hours." Her stomach twisted. "This is starting to feel weird." Daniel chuckled. "Or maybe he just wants to talk." Andrea crossed her arms. "The man looked like someone who sleeps in train stations, and now he's walking around like a five-star client. That's not normal." The manager gave her a patient look. "He's the kind of person who doesn't like being recognized. Some people want to live like everyone else just for a few days. It happens." Andrea didn't reply. She filed the comment away silently and returned to the computer. She preferred to keep her distance. The problem was that, even trying, she couldn't stop thinking about those curious eyes and that unnervingly simple way he spoke. It was as if nothing about him was truly real. Around noon, Andrea was finishing a report when Marcus, the security guard, approached and whispered near her ear. "The guest from the presidential suite is at the restaurant. He asked if you'd have lunch with him." Andrea raised an eyebrow. "You're kidding, right?" Marcus smiled. He was very polite, said he'd understand if you said no, but that he'd enjoy the company. She took a deep breath. That kind of request crossed the line of what was expected from a guest, and yet something inside her stopped her from declining. 15 minutes later, she was seated at a corner table in the hotel's restaurant, facing a partial view of Fifth Avenue, sipping sparkling water across from a man who smiled so naturally that it was impossible to feel uncomfortable for long. "I hope I'm not being intrusive," he said, looking at her with a calm but sincere gaze. "It's just, you were the first person who treated me with humanity, even though you thought I was just some bum." Andrea swallowed hard. She didn't know how to respond. "I'm sorry if I was rude," she said at last. "It's not easy to trust people in this environment. I've had my share of guests pretending to be something they're not." Joshua nodded. "I get it. You were firm, but kind. You even offered me money for a sandwich." He laughed softly, picking up the menu. "I never did use it, by the way. It's right here." He pulled out the $5 bill and placed it on the table. "You can have it back." Andrea blushed, unsure where to put her hands. "You really didn't have to." "Yes, I did," he said, locking eyes with her. "No one's ever done something like that for me." His eyes were intense, but not intimidating. Andrea looked away, her cheeks warm. "So," she began, shifting the subject, "you say you want to be treated like a regular person, but then you request the presidential suite. That doesn't quite line up." Joshua smiled. "That's exactly why I did it. I like the contrast. I want to see how far the difference goes between what people expect from me and who I actually am." They ordered simple dishes. Andrea chose a lentil salad with goat cheese. Joshua went with the daily special, some kind of roasted chicken, with vegetables, no truffles, no foie gras, no overpriced wine. He seemed genuinely entertained by her constant surprise. The conversation flowed so easily that Andrea forgot she was still on the clock. When the meal was over, Joshua stood first and offered his hand to help her up. She hesitated half a second, then accepted. His hand was firm and warm. As they left the restaurant, she headed back to the front desk, and he returned to the top floor. But something had shifted. The impression that he was an intruder had begun to fade. In its place, a different feeling was growing, one that unsettled her curiosity. Andrea still didn't know who he was or why he had shown up the way he did, but one thing was becoming clear. Joshua Carter didn't fit into any category she recognized, and the more she tried to define him, the more he seemed to defy every label she could think of. Andrea showed up at the hotel early the next day, but not for work. Her shift wouldn't start until the afternoon, yet she arrived before 8, with a light backpack slung over one shoulder and an old notebook clutched in her hands. She didn't notify anyone. She didn't pass through the staff lounge. Instead, she walked straight into the cafe adjoining the lobby and sat at the last table near the window, the one with the best view of the main hall. From there, she could observe the movement of guests and staff without being seen. She ordered a latte and a croissant, but barely touched either. Her mind was too preoccupied. She'd spent the entire night replaying every detail of her conversation with Joshua. His story, or rather the lack of one, had raised more questions than answers. He spoke fluently about almost anything, had knowledge that suggested education and experience, but avoided anchoring himself to any single version of reality. And even though he had casually booked the presidential suite, he moved through the hotel like someone unfamiliar with luxury. It was a contradiction, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. With her notebook open in front of her, Andrea began to scribble a list. It wasn't really a plan, more like a way to organize her thoughts. At the top she wrote, "Things rich people should never do in luxury hotels." Then she started jotting down examples. Don't wear flip-flops in the lobby. Don't stash pastries from the breakfast buffet in your pockets. Don't ask the price of everything, especially if you can afford it. And definitely don't try to wash your hands in the decorative fountain in the courtyard. Yes, that had actually happened once. The list wasn't fiction. It was a collection of real-life stories pulled from her years behind the front desk. She was writing out of habit, but soon realized what she was doing. The guide was for Joshua, a makeshift manual for someone who didn't seem to know how to behave in the world he was moving through. And she wasn't doing it out of pity, not out of duty either. It was something harder to explain, maybe because he had listened to her with humility, or maybe because for the first time in a long time she felt heard. Joshua appeared in the lobby just after 9. He was carrying the same massive backpack, but now wore clean clothes, still simple but neat and well-fitted. Andrea watched from a distance as he chatted with one of the housekeeping staff near the elevator. He smiled, and so did she. That caught Andrea's attention. Guests from the top floor didn't usually engage with employees like that. When he walked toward the cafe, she had already closed the notebook. Joshua spotted her and smiled as if seeing her there made perfect sense. He sat across from her with the ease of someone who didn't need permission. "Morning," he said, grabbing a bottle of water from the next table. "You always wake up early to think?" Andrea smiled, caught off guard. "Sometimes." She pushed the notebook toward him. "I was writing something, a kind of guide." Joshua read the title and chuckled softly. "Survival Guide for the Newly Rich." She nodded. "Might sound silly, but I figured it could be useful to someone who doesn't seem too familiar with certain expectations." Joshua flipped through a few pages. He read the notes silently, a smile slowly forming on his face. "Use utensils for everything, even pizza. Don't photograph your food. Avoid talking about money with other guests. Never help yourself directly from the room service tray." He raised his eyebrows and looked up. "Are you teaching me how to look rich?" "I'm trying to save you from embarrassment," she corrected gently. "Some behaviors trigger reactions, comments, side glances, and I know you don't care about that, but maybe you should." Joshua closed the notebook and rested his arms on the table. "Do you always care so much about appearances?" Andrea took a breath. "Not the appearances themselves, but the consequences. I've seen people treated like garbage just because they didn't fit in. And I've seen others get special treatment for knowing how to dress, how to act. I don't think it's fair, but it's real." He nodded slowly. "So, you want to teach me how to survive in this world?" She tilted her head in affirmation. "I want to help you avoid being laughed at." They spent the entire morning together. Joshua kept reading her notes, asked questions. shared stories about places he'd visited. Some sounded too bizarre to be fake. Others were so simple they hurt to hear. When she asked how he spoke so many languages, because yes, he was fluent in German, Spanish, and even a bit of Italian, he answered with a disarming kind of ease. Movies, books, travel. Words interest me more than things. Andrea didn't know how to reconcile that with the image she had formed of him. He was far too articulate to be some lost wanderer, yet too grounded to have grown up surrounded by luxury. He existed somewhere in the middle, a puzzle that laughed, paid attention, and took her suggestions seriously, like a student eager to learn. When the clock struck noon, she realized she hadn't noticed time passing. The morning had unfolded like a conversation between old friends, and that somehow felt more surreal than anything he could have told her. Before they parted, Andrea handed the notebook to him. "Keep it. You can add your own rules if you want." Joshua took it gently, like it was something valuable. "Are you always like this?" he asked. "Like what?" she replied. "Observant, direct, generous without being sentimental." Andrea gave a half smile. "Only when I'm not being judged." He smiled back. "Then I hope that never changes." When they stood up, Joshua glanced around, almost as if memorizing every detail of the space. And just before walking away, he said something she didn't expect. "You know what's funny? You probably understand the world of the wealthy better than a lot of actual rich people." Then he left. She stood there for a few seconds, staring at the empty chair. She still didn't know who he really was, but she was starting to understand why she couldn't get him out of her head. Andrea arrived at work earlier than scheduled, even though she had promised herself she wouldn't do that anymore. But something felt different that morning. She couldn't pretend Joshua was just another guest. She was far too involved by now. And even if she didn't fully admit it to herself, part of her was curious to see how he'd react to the makeshift manual she'd handed him the day before. She didn't have to wait long. Shortly after 9, he appeared in the lobby wearing new clothes, dark jeans that fit well, a crisp light blue button-up shirt, clean shoes, and a neutral-colored coat that made him nearly unrecognizable. The backpack was still with him, but now it seemed like part of a different story. Andrea watched from a distance as he spoke calmly with someone at the concierge desk. There was something in his posture that stood out, like a man who had studied the room and now chose each move with deliberate care. The fact that Joshua had altered his appearance so quickly and seemingly based on her suggestions sparked a strange mix of pride and unease in Andrea. She knew men who dismissed advice, especially from younger women, particularly in places like this. But Joshua, he'd listened, not to please her, but because he genuinely valued her perspective. That disarmed her. A little past mid-afternoon, as Andrea returned from a quick break, she found him waiting near the reception desk. No announcement, no attitude, no dramatic gesture. He simply said he wanted to show her something. The lobby was quiet, no guests waiting in line, and Daniel, observing from across the hall, gave her a subtle nod that she could step away. She followed Joshua up to the hotel's rooftop terrace, which was closed that day for maintenance. From there, they had a view of the Hudson River and the brick rooftops of the surrounding buildings. Joshua reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the notebook she had given him. He had filled in more pages. His notes went far beyond what Andrea expected. They weren't just additions to the guide. He had turned the whole thing into a reflection on behavior, status, and the real value of human interaction. He wrote with clarity, like someone who thought while he wrote. One page described how 3 different employees had treated him within 10 minutes, before and after he changed clothes, and how that shift in appearance changed their tone. Another entry explored the impact of greeting staff by name, and how that subtle gesture softened their demeanor. Andrea read it all in silence, a lump forming in her throat. She couldn't tell whether it was from seeing herself acknowledged in those observations or from realizing just how deeply he was engaging with this world of rules and unspoken codes. When she handed the notebook back to him, Joshua didn't say a word. He simply looked out toward the horizon, as if deciding whether he wanted to say anything more. She didn't press him. That moment was enough. That night, Joshua didn't return to the hotel. Andrea noticed his absence the next morning, while checking the registry. He had left without taking any bags, which in his case meant just the old backpack, no refund request, no message. The presidential suite was still paid for through the end of the week, but now sat empty. When she brought it up to Daniel, he responded calmly, like someone who had seen it all before. "He tends to disappear for a few days," he said, "but he never stays gone for long. If he didn't leave instructions, it means he doesn't want to be found right now." Andrea didn't answer. She tucked that comment away in her mind. Later, while closing out the cash drawer for her shift, she found a plain envelope with her name written on it in steady, deliberate handwriting. Inside, there was a receipt from a boutique in Soho and a small note. "I used everything you taught me. I'll be back soon. Joshua." The tone was light, the lettering steady, but she knew there was something in those words that couldn't be said out loud. In the days that followed, Andrea found herself watching the guests more closely, as if searching for clues. It wasn't intentional, it was automatic. Something in her was waiting for him, even if she didn't say it aloud. And during those quiet intervals, she kept replaying what she had written in the notebook. The tips, the examples, the spontaneous notes. She found herself mentally refining the list, thinking of new rules, new entries that belonged in that little survival guide. The notebook was no longer in her possession, but she hadn't stopped building the bridge it represented. A kind of map between two worlds that rarely touched. Deep down, she knew, even if Joshua never returned, he had already left something behind. Something that wouldn't disappear just because he walked out the revolving door. That morning, Joshua came back as if he'd never left. He walked through the lobby's revolving door with the same calm as always, now wearing tailored clothes. Quietly elegant, not flashy, but unmistakably refined. The backpack was gone, replaced by a small leather briefcase. Andrea spotted him from the front desk and, even though she tried to keep her focus on the computer screen, she couldn't ignore the way he was walking straight toward her. He greeted her with a soft smile, as if nothing had changed. No explanation, no ceremony, just a return, quiet, complete. And for Andrea, that was enough. She met his gaze and nodded back. A small acknowledgement from someone who understood that not all absences need to be explained. Joshua moved through the hotel now, with the ease of someone who had never been gone. Andrea saw him entering and exiting elevators, exchanging brief conversations with Daniel in the lobby, strolling down the hallways with calm, unhurried steps. Dressed in tailored clothes, carrying a leather briefcase, he no longer looked like the casual traveler who had checked in days earlier. But it wasn't just the way he dressed that had changed. There was something different in the way he looked, at her from across the room, in how he approached with a quiet kind of focus, in the way he spoke to staff, clear, direct, steady. She began to notice the signs, how he never needed to show a key card, how no one ever asked him to sign anything, how there was no open balance on his account. Yet he stayed discreet, never drew attention to himself. He moved through the building, like someone who knew every corner of it. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon when Andrea realized something out of the ordinary was about to happen. The lobby was calm when Daniel walked over and, in a casual tone, told her she'd have an extended break that day. "Mr. Carter asked if he could speak with you for a few minutes," he said, not really offering a chance to decline. "I figured you earned the invite," Andrea gave a small nod and headed toward the rooftop terrace where she had seen him once before in a quieter moment. Joshua was already there, waiting by a table set for two. 2 cups of coffee, a plate of madeleines, and that same neutral expression she had begun to learn how to read. He gestured toward the chair with simple courtesy, and once she sat, he poured the coffee with deliberate, almost ceremonial movements. There was no small talk. He asked about her life outside the hotel, if she had siblings, who she lived with, what she dreamed of doing beyond the front desk. Andrea answered little by little, reserved but truthful. She told him she lived alone, that she had started college but didn't finish, that she liked her job, even when it wore her out. Joshua listened carefully. There was no hint of judgment. In his eyes, no empty curiosity, just quiet interest. Andrea found that with him the words came easier. She told him about her childhood in Brooklyn, about the grandmother who raised her while her mum worked long shifts, about summers spent in upstate New York that still made her nostalgic. He didn't interrupt. He filled the pauses with simple gestures. More coffee, a light comment, a steady glance. The conversation settled into a gentle rhythm, as if time had slowed down just for this. At one point, she asked why he wanted to talk with her in the first place. Joshua shrugged, said it was rare to speak to someone who wasn't trying to sell something or impress anyone, that almost everything in this building was scripted, except her. Andrea didn't know what to say to that. She just looked at him and stored the words in the back of her mind, like they might come in handy later. As the clock signaled that her break was almost up, Andrea started to rise, but Joshua stopped her with a quiet request. He said he didn't want anything from her. No secrets about the hotel, no forced politeness. He just wanted to know the woman who could command an entire lobby with a single look and still greet everyone with a smile. Andrea's eyebrows lifted, slightly at the honesty, but she didn't respond with sarcasm or distance. She simply thanked him. When she finally stood, he walked her to the terrace door and said he hoped they could share coffee again sometime. She nodded once, her hair a bit tousled by the breeze, her fingers still warm from the porcelain cup. For the rest of her shift, Andrea couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. It hadn't been flirtation, and it wasn't an interrogation. It was something else, something quieter but more affecting. Someone had taken interest in who she was, not just the role she played behind the desk. At the end of her shift, she walked to the subway slower than usual, as if the entire city had shifted pace. At home, she opened the kitchen window and let the cool air in. She cooked something simple, ate slowly, and before going to bed, picked up a book she had abandoned months earlier. When she finally closed her eyes, she could still hear his voice. The way he listened, the words he used, the feeling that, just for a few minutes, she had truly been seen. It was a quiet Friday afternoon, and Andrea was sorting through reception paperwork with more dedication than necessary. She was alone at the front desk, the soft hum of elevators going up and down serving as background noise. The guest flow had slowed by that hour, and most check-ins and inquiries were already wrapped up. Still, she remained focused, double-checking bookings, cross-referencing payment information, reviewing transfer instructions. There was something grounding about that kind of functional silence. Maybe it was her way of avoiding how much she'd been thinking about Joshua, who hadn't passed through the lobby that morning, nor placed any room service requests. She pretended not to notice, but every pause between emails became a disguised moment of waiting. And when, around 5, she spotted Mr. Reynolds stepping out of the main office alongside Joshua, who carried a folder under his arm, her body reacted before her mind caught up. It wasn't quite surprise, more like a quiet jolt, an alert triggered by the reappearance of someone who had already become part of her routine. Joshua walked past the desk without stopping, but looked directly at her. A short glance, steady, unspoken, as if he already knew she'd be watching. Andrea quickly lowered her eyes back to the computer screen, pretending she hadn't been hoping to see him. Even so, just a few minutes later, she noticed a small note left near the reception phone. It was a plain piece of paper with clean, confident handwriting. "If you can, meet me in the small conference room at 6. No context, no signature. But she knew exactly who had written it. She hesitated for a few seconds, then slipped the note into her pocket and returned to her work. She acted like it wasn't a big deal, like it wouldn't matter whether she went or not. But deep down, she already knew she would. When the time came, she informed the security guard she'd be stepping away for a few minutes and headed down one of the service corridors usually reserved for executives avoiding attention. The room was empty, except for Joshua, who stood. The moment she walked in, "Thanks for coming," he said, pulling out a chair for her. Andrea sat carefully, resting her arms on the table as she took in the space. She had never been in that room before. It was discreet, with light-colored furniture, a modern painting on the wall, and small windows that looked out over the back of the building. Nothing like the showy decor of the lobby. Joshua opened the folder and pulled out a stack of documents. He handed her one gently. "This is a purchase contract for the hotel." Andrea furrowed her brow. "What do you mean?" He remained composed. "The St. Clair Hotel has been in my family since the 90s. A few months ago, my mother decided to sell the remaining shares. Today, I finalized the repurchase. I now own it outright." Andrea didn't say anything. She stared at the document, unsure what to do with that kind of news. "And why are you telling me this?" she asked. Joshua leaned back slightly in his chair. "Because I thought you deserved to know who's really behind the place you work at." She read through the names, numbers, and clauses in the contract. There was no doubt his name was there. He wasn't just another guest. He was the owner, the heir, the investor dressed as a drifter. And more than that, he had chosen to blend in with the staff, to observe from within. "Is this some kind of test?" she asked, eyes still on the page. "Not exactly," he replied. "I wanted to understand how my own property really runs, without reports and spreadsheets. I wanted to see the hallways, the faces, the interactions. I wanted to hear conversations in the elevator, see how the receptionist handles a last-minute request, how the waiter treats someone who doesn't look wealthy." Andrea kept her expression neutral. "And now that you've seen it all, planning to fire half the staff?" Joshua shook his head. "No, the opposite, actually. I want to restructure things, to make management more human, more transparent." She crossed her arms. "And you think people are going to buy this story?" He smiled. "I don't need them to buy it. I just need to do the right thing." There was a strange knot forming in her chest. The man she thought she had been helping, with shift lists and notebook notes, was actually the one in charge of it all. A man who could buy the whole building with a single click, yet listen to her suggestions about tableware and dress codes. It made her feel exposed, as if everything she thought she had under control was just part of a larger picture she hadn't seen. Joshua seemed to notice. "I wasn't playing you," he said, softer now. "Every word, every moment, it was all real, even the coffee on the terrace." Andrea ran a hand through her hair. "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because no one listens when I introduce myself as the owner. Everyone just wants something. But you tried to keep me at a distance. You corrected me. Then you opened up. And I realized that was the only way to see things for what they are." She looked at him for a long beat. "And now what? What do you want me to do with all this?" Joshua took a breath. "Nothing. I just wanted you to know." Andrea was the first to stand. She wasn't angry and she wasn't hurt, but something had definitely shifted. It felt like she was suddenly part of something bigger than she had expected. Before leaving, she looked at him again. "You don't need tips on how to act like a regular person, Joshua. You just need to decide who you are when no one's watching." Then she walked out. Her steps were steady, as she made her way back to the front desk. Her body still felt tense, her mind processing everything. She didn't yet know how to fully digest what had just happened, but for the first time, she knew exactly who she was dealing with. And that changed a lot. Or maybe it changed nothing. It was too early to tell. On Friday, just before the end of her shift, Andrea was finishing check-in for a group of Spanish executives when she noticed a brown envelope being discreetly placed on the counter. Her colleague from the evening shift hadn't arrived yet. The lobby was calm, and no one seemed to be lingering nearby. She picked it up cautiously, immediately recognizing her name written on the front in neat handwriting. Andrea. She opened it carefully. Inside was a short, direct note. Small meeting room, 6 p.m. if you can. No signature, none needed. She folded the paper, slipped it into her pocket, and tried to focus on her last duties for the day. But she already knew this wasn't going to be just another casual encounter. Whatever Joshua wanted, it wouldn't be simple small talk. Just past 6, Andrea dropped her badge into her bag, took the service elevator, and headed to the second floor. The small conference room was typically used for internal meetings, out of sight from guests. The door was slightly ajar when she arrived. She knocked twice and stepped inside. Joshua was there alone, standing by the table, no blazer, white shirt sleeves rolled up, his expression marked by the wear of the day, but also the resolve of someone who had something important to say. No small talk. As soon as she closed the door behind her, he motioned to the chair across from him and began to speak. He said he owed her an explanation, that he hadn't been fully honest from the beginning, but he hadn't exactly lied either. He explained that the hotel had belonged to his family for decades, but he'd stayed out of the business for years. Only recently had he taken full control after ending legal disputes and dissolving old contracts. And when he returned, he told no one, not even Daniel, who only realized what was happening when he saw him walk through the lobby in worn-out clothes, right off a research trip. Andrea listened without interruption. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with uncomfortable precision. The guest who seemed out of place, the overstuffed backpack, the lack of reservations, the way he moved through the hotel, the long pauses, the observant eyes. He hadn't been lost at all. He was testing familiar ground. She now understood why no one ever asked him for ID, why Daniel always seemed to be one step ahead, why no card was needed when Joshua made a request. He was the owner, and still he chose to walk in as if he weren't. When he pulled the notebook from his bag, the one she had given him days earlier, with a title scribbled in blue pen, "Survival Guide for the Newly Rich." She almost smiled. He'd kept it, and had filled it with his own notes. Some were ironic, some practical, others read like short stories about hotel life. Andrea flipped through the pages naturally, recognizing his tone in every line. "Did you use me as an experiment?" she asked, eyes still on the page. "No," he said. "I used the setting, the staff, the services, but you were the one real thing in all of it." She closed the notebook slowly, resting her hands on the table before rising to her feet and facing him. There was no tension in her stance, no accusation, but something needed to be said, and she didn't plan to hold it back. "I wasn't fair to you at the beginning," she said firmly. "It wasn't just professional caution. I looked at you and assumed the worst. I treated you like someone I already knew." Joshua didn't flinch. "I noticed," he replied, "but I didn't take it personally. You work in a luxury hotel. You've probably seen more abuse in tailored suits than decency with a backpack. I would have reacted the same way." Andrea exhaled deeply. "Still, thank you for not pushing back." He gave a faint smile. "You saw me the way the world probably would, but you offered me a sandwich. That meant more than any perfect welcome ever could." They stood there for a few seconds, looking at each other. Joshua reached out his hand. It wasn't a dramatic gesture or a romantic invitation. It was simply what made sense. Andrea accepted it. The handshake was firm, not formal, not overly gentle, just steady, clear. The kind of contact that didn't require more words to be understood. When she let go, it was at the right moment. He opened the door for her, and she stepped out into the hallway without looking back. Her face no longer bore the guarded expression of those early days. But there wasn't a carefree smile either. What she carried now was something else entirely, a quiet certainty about the ground she was standing on. Knowing the truth about Joshua didn't erase the past days, but it gave weight to everything that came before. And strangely, even with all the answers in her hands, a lingering sense of mystery remained, not about him, but about whatever might come next. On Tuesday, just past 4 in the afternoon, Andrea was wrapping up the final details of an occupancy report when a small envelope was quietly placed next to the phone at the front desk. It was folded in half, unbranded, discreet. Her name was handwritten on the front in a style she now recognized immediately. She opened it with a calm hand, though her heart was already pounding before she reached the end of the message. "If you're free tonight, I'd like to take you to dinner. Quiet place, nothing formal, just the two of us. No time, no address, just the invitation." She looked around as if someone might have seen her reading it. Then she tucked the paper into her pocket and went back to work. For the rest of her shift, she kept her expression focused and her movements sharp. But her thoughts were anything but settled. She wanted to say yes, but knowing who he really was now, the idea stirred discomfort. Joshua wasn't just an unusual guest anymore. He was the owner, and no matter how relaxed his manner seemed, that changed everything. When her shift ended and she headed to the locker room, she was still undecided. She considered writing a polite refusal, making up an excuse, pretending she hadn't seen the note, but a part of her didn't want to miss the chance to be with him. So she sent a short message, accepting the invitation and letting him know she'd be ready by 8. Then she left the hotel with her hair still pulled back and her bag held close to her side, boarding the subway like someone carrying the weight of a fresh decision. At home, she showered and changed clothes 3 times. She finally settled on a dark blue dress, simple, knee-length, with sleeves that covered her shoulders and no neckline that said too much. She packed a scarf and a jacket for later. It was modest, flattering, the kind of outfit that left everything unsaid. When Joshua arrived just before 8, there was no black car or driver. Just him, standing on the sidewalk in front of her. Building, wearing a black shirt and light trousers, sleeves rolled up, a plain watch on his wrist. She didn't text to say she was coming down, just stepped out, and he smiled when he saw her. A smile without any hint of conquest. Only quiet. Happiness to see her there. They walked to the restaurant. A small place tucked along a quiet side street in the 6th arrondissement. The lights were warm, the decor understated, and the tables spaced comfortably apart. They were seated at the back, a table for 2 with a partial view of the street. They ordered wine and simple food. She chose fish with vegetables. He went for pasta with herbs and cheese. Conversation came easily. They talked about food, films, travel. Andrea mentioned a book she had started rereading, and he told her about a village in Spain where he'd lived for nearly 6 months. She laughed more than she expected. So did he. The evening flowed with ease, with no awkward pauses, as if dinners like this had always been part of their lives. Andrea no longer avoided looking him in the eye, and Joshua, for his part, watched her with a kind of quiet attention, never pressing, never pulling, just fully present. By the time they left the restaurant, it was past 10. The night was cool but dry, the clear sky making the city lights more vivid. Joshua suggested a walk. Andrea nodded, pulling her scarf around her neck. They wandered for several blocks without a destination, past closed shop windows, bakeries gone quiet, and bistros shutting down. At one point, he touched her arm gently to guide her down a calmer side street. She didn't resist. They walked side by side, their pace naturally matched, their conversation slowing, not from lack of things to say, but because words weren't needed now. They stopped in front of a small park, empty at this hour, where a wooden bench sat beneath a low tree. They didn't sit, just stood facing each other, and then he stepped closer. He didn't ask, he didn't make any dramatic move. He simply narrowed the space between them with quiet certainty and steady eyes. When his lips met hers, the kiss was slow, measured, but it held a firmness that spoke louder than words. Andrea responded without hesitation. Her hand found his arm, her body leaned slightly forward, and for a few moments, nothing around them mattered. It wasn't a rushed kiss, it was a connection. When they pulled back, Joshua kept his gaze on her, as if memorizing the moment. Andrea held his eyes for a few seconds longer, then looked down and smiled, softly, like someone quietly admitting something to herself. He walked her back to her building. He didn't ask to come up. He didn't linger, just said goodbye with another kiss and the simple promise to see her again soon. That night, when she entered her apartment, Andrea didn't turn on the TV or check her phone. She took off her shoes, walked to the bedroom, and sat on the bed. Her body still held the warmth of his presence, and her thoughts, though fully aware of everything, didn't try to fight what had just begun. She knew this could get complicated, that the differences between them were real, that the hotel was part of it all. But none of that felt bigger than the truth of that kiss, than the desire she felt to make it last just a little longer, than the clarity that she wanted to see him again, without doubt, without fear. The next morning, Andrea arrived at the hotel, still feeling the lingering warmth of the night before. She knew she couldn't act differently in front of the team, not in the lobby, not during the routine tasks. But inside, she carried a quiet truth that pulsed with every breath. The evening with Joshua hadn't just been pleasant. It had been light, intimate, quietly transformative. There had been no promises, no official declarations, but there was desire and the unmistakable wish to experience it again. Even so, she stayed focused. She checked emails, reviewed guest checkout records, and coordinated the departure of a large conference group. Around 10, Daniel appeared beside the front desk, holding a white envelope and smiling. "When you're done there, come by my office. I've got something for you." She gave a quick nod, her stomach tightening immediately. This wasn't part of the routine. A few minutes later, she stepped into Daniel's office with calm steps. He handed her the envelope and waited silently. Andrea opened it carefully and read. It was an internal announcement signed by upper management, officially promoting her to section supervisor, a role that included overseeing the front desk team and working closely with the events department, especially during high-level functions. The position came with a pay raise, more responsibilities, and direct coordination with the hotel's leadership, which in practice meant working with Joshua on special occasions. When she finished reading, she looked up. "Was this your idea?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "The recommendation came from me, but final approval came from the owner, of course." She took a deep breath. "Thank you for the trust. You earned it, Andrea. This role needs someone who can balance authority with grace. You already do that every day. Now it's just official." She left his office with the envelope folded in her hand, her heart tight. The promotion was fair. She knew that. But the timing felt uncomfortable. She walked through the back hallway to the administrative wing and paused in front of Joshua's office door. She knocked twice, entered when she heard his voice. He was alone, reviewing a spreadsheet on his laptop, but closed everything the moment he saw her. "Congratulations on the new role," he said with ease. Andrea remained standing. "Was this your doing?" Joshua leaned back in his chair. Daniel made the suggestion. I just approved it. You didn't think the timing might seem inappropriate? He lifted his eyebrows slightly. I trust your work. That's what the decision is based on. But right after what happened, her tone held no accusation, but it was steady. Joshua's remained calm. If you hadn't earned it, I wouldn't have signed off. But if you'd rather turn it down, you can. No pressure, no strings. She inhaled slowly. I don't want to turn it down. I just don't want anyone thinking I got it because of what's going on between us. Joshua stood and walked to her, stopping just a few steps away. I'm not asking you to hide anything, but I also don't want you feeling like you owe anyone an explanation. You've earned this on your own. The rest is just between us. Andrea looked at him. His eyes didn't waver. There was no doubt in them, no manipulation, just sincerity. Okay, she said finally. I just needed to hear that from you. And now that you have, now I can accept it. Joshua touched her arm gently, then wrapped his arms around her waist. The kiss that followed wasn't like the one from the night before. It was firmer, more present. Andrea didn't hold back. Her hands found his shoulders, her body leaned into his. For a moment, they lost track of the world outside that office. And when they finally pulled away, their breaths uneven, their eyes held more meaning than any spoken words could. Over the following weeks, everything shifted. Andrea embraced her new role with responsibility and focus. She was present in internal meetings, scheduled shifts, coordinated the front desk team, and served as a key link between operations and events. Her contact with Joshua became more frequent, though always discreet. At the hotel, they remained professional. Outside of it, they continued seeing each other. They dined in quiet restaurants, visited local exhibits, walked together through less touristy neighborhoods. Joshua showed a genuine interest in everything she liked, and in her with every gesture. There was no flashiness, no pressure, just consistency, the kind that builds something real. On weekends, he picked her up for day trips. Sometimes they stayed in, sometimes they left the city. But in every moment together, something deeper began to take root. Trust. Andrea no longer pretended she was unaffected. She liked him, missed him between days, thought about him when she woke up, and when Joshua told her he felt the same, she believed it. Not because he insisted, but because he showed her through actions. He knew her boundaries, respected her pace, and handled her feelings with care. Her professional life was more demanding now, but also more stable. And her personal life, though still undefined, had taken form. Andrea didn't know where it was all going, but unlike the way she would have felt months ago, she wasn't afraid of the outcome. She just wanted to be there, to keep showing up, growing, and finding out what else this new life, inside and outside the hotel, might offer her next. It was a mild Saturday, with clear skies and quiet streets. Andrea used her day off to tidy up the apartment. She pulled fresh sheets from the drawer, replaced the bathroom towels, and wiped down the small, open-plan kitchen where she barely cooked. During the work week, she didn't rush but paid attention to the details. When everything felt in place, she sent Joshua a short message. "What do you think about dinner here tonight? I'll buy the ingredients. Let me know." His reply came minutes later, as direct as always. "I'll be there by 7. Let me help." She smiled reading it. No excuses, no overstatements. That's how things had been unfolding between them, naturally, through quiet invitations and the complete absence of urgency. She walked to the neighborhood market, picked out fresh vegetables, a bottle of wine, herbs, and chicken. She wanted to prepare everything herself. On meaningful days like this, ordering takeout never felt right. At exactly 7 p.m., he rang the bell. He wore dark jeans and a blue shirt with the sleeves casually rolled up. He carried a bag with bread, cheese, and a dessert she had once mentioned in passing. Andrea opened the door with her hair loosely tied and a cotton shirt rolled up to her elbows. He stepped in, glanced around the space with quiet interest, and set the bag on the table. He didn't comment on how clean everything looked or the inviting smell coming from the pot on the stove. He just stepped closer, rested a hand on the small of her back, and said softly, "It's good to be here." She met his gaze with one that didn't need words. They moved toward the kitchen together. She showed him the chopped vegetables, and he took over, slicing the last onion. They traded thoughts on recipes, laughed when the olive oil sizzled too loudly, and Joshua took over the skillet like someone who respected the process. They cooked side by side, bodies close, their movements naturally in sync, not rehearsed but familiar enough to feel effortless. They had dinner at the small table tucked near the wall, sipping wine under the soft light of a lamp above the bookshelf. They talked about the hotel, upcoming events, and the quirks of returning guests. Then their conversation drifted to childhood stories and silly memories that still made them laugh. Andrea felt completely at ease. Nothing felt forced. Joshua didn't dominate the moment, didn't correct her, didn't try to steer the night. He simply shared it, and for her, that balance was rare. When the meal ended, she got up to fetch dessert spoons, but he gently took her hand. It wasn't a dramatic move, it was just the right moment. She stopped. He leaned in and kissed her with intensity. It was different from before, longer, more certain. His hands found her waist. Hers rested on his shoulders. There was no hesitation left between them. They stayed there for a while, exchanging long kisses and quiet touches until they made their way to the bedroom, slowly but with quiet resolve. His hands were deliberate, full of care and desire. She undressed with the ease of someone who didn't feel the need to hide. His body over hers didn't feel overpowering. It felt like surrender. He touched her shoulders, her hips, her stomach, like someone not in a rush to conquer but wanting to discover. And when she pulled him down to her with force, when they gave in to each other on that bed, there was no longer any distance between what they thought, what they wanted, and what they felt. The intimacy unfolded without grand words, without empty promises. The pleasure was shared, deep and real. When their breathing finally slowed, Joshua pulled her close from behind, his chest against her back. She held his hand across her stomach, and the two of them, lying there in the dark, seemed to know that the night had sealed something they didn't need to explain. On Sunday morning, they woke up together. Sunlight slipped through the window blinds, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the small apartment. Andrea wore one of his shirts. She toasted 2 baguettes with butter while he washed the dishes from the night before. They shared breakfast, laughing about strange guests and last-minute mishaps at work. Later, they stepped out for a walk. They passed a small flea market, looked through the windows of closed bookstores, and eventually sat on a stone bench near a dry fountain. They didn't talk about the future or define what they were. They talked about the moment, and that somehow was enough. Andrea leaned her head on his shoulder. Joshua slid his arm around her and kissed the top of her head. The day passed slowly, as if the world outside had no schedule to keep. When evening came, they returned to her apartment. They shared a snack they picked up on the way back, then curled up on the couch to watch a random movie. They didn't know what would come next, but they both knew, without saying it, that they didn't want to go back to life without this. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.